The year is 1823. A land surveyor named Alastair Finch pushes through the dense, unforgiving foliage of the Virginian backcountry, miles from the nearest settlement. The air here is heavy, still, and carries a peculiar scent of damp earth and decay that clings to the back of the throat. His commission is simple: to chart the boundaries of a forgotten parcel of land, a tract deeded to the state after its previous owner vanished from all records decades prior. The property is known to the locals by a name whispered only in hushed, fearful tones: Blackwood's Folly. As Alastair drives a stake into the ground, his iron mallet strikes something that is not stone. It gives way with a soft, sickening crunch. He kneels, brushing away the leaves and topsoil, and his blood runs cold. It is a bone, small, delicate, and unmistakably human. A ribcage, no larger than that of a young child. His professional curiosity curdles into primal dread. He digs further, his hands trembling. He uncovers another, and then another. They are not random, they are organized. Neat, shallow depressions, each containing a small skeleton arranged in ordered rows that stretch out before him in the dappled, oppressive light of the forest. There are dozens, perhaps more. An entire field of them, a silent, macabre orchard of the dead, each grave marked by nothing but a slight indentation in the earth. There are no headstones, no crosses, no names. Just the silent, accusing remains of children, buried in a place the world had intentionally forgotten. Alastair scrambles back, the silence of the woods now screaming at him. He has stumbled upon something unholy, a secret that has been sleeping for over 30 years. He has found the forbidden grounds of the Blackwood Orphanage, and in doing so, has unearthed the opening chapter of one of Virginia's most horrifying and deeply buried cold cases. To understand the horror Alastair Finch unearthed in 1823, we must rewind the clock to 1789. The ink on the United States Constitution is barely dry. Virginia, a state scarred and impoverished by the Revolutionary War, is grappling with the ghosts of conflict. Its cities are teeming with the dispossessed, and its countryside is haunted by the specters of famine and disease. The most vulnerable victims of this new, uncertain era are the children. Orphans of war, plague, and poverty wander the streets, their futures as bleak as the winter sky. It is in this climate of desperation that a curious proposition is made to the elders of Ambrose County. A man and a woman, Silas and Alara Blackwood, arrive with a substantial inheritance and a seemingly noble purpose. They are a strange, austere couple, dressed in severe, dark clothing that is out of fashion even for the time. Silas is tall and gaunt, with eyes that seem to look straight through a person, while Alara is a phantom in his shadow, her face perpetually veiled by a mourning bonnet, though no one knows who she is mourning. They wish to purchase the old Northwood plantation, a remote and sprawling property that has sat derelict for years, bordered by dense, ancient woods and a stagnant, blackwater swamp. They propose to turn it into a sanctuary, an orphanage for the county's most desperate children. They call it the Haven of Innocence. The county, overwhelmed and eager to solve its orphan problem, agrees with little hesitation. They see a charitable act, a blessing from a pious couple. They do not see the darkness lurking behind Silas's vacant stare, nor the profound, unsettling sorrow that radiates from his veiled wife. They are inviting a serpent into their garden, and the price of their desperate convenience will be a horrifying tale whispered for generations. The Haven of Innocence was established with an unnerving efficiency. Within months, the crumbling plantation manor was repaired, its windows painted black, and a high, wrought-iron fence was erected around the entire perimeter, its gate kept perpetually locked. The Blackwoods began accepting children, taking in dozens of orphans from Ambrose County and beyond. But from the very beginning, something was deeply wrong. The orphanage was less a haven and more a prison, governed by a set of rules so strict and bizarre they bordered on the fanatical. The first and most absolute rule was the rule of silence. Children were forbidden from speaking above a whisper. Laughter was considered a sin, a vulgar noise that disturbed the sacred quiet Silas Blackwood demanded. Play was banned. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, spent their days in silent labor, mending clothes, tending a barren garden and scrubbing floors with lye until their knuckles were raw. Their only education came from Silas himself, who would read to them for an hour each evening. But he did not read from the Bible, or from primers, or from books of moral instruction. He read from a single, leather-bound tome of his own creation, a text filled with macabre parables about the corrupting influence of the living world and the serene, holy purity of the great sleep. He spoke of the earth as a cradle, a gentle mother waiting to embrace the innocent and protect them from the inevitable decay of life. His words were poison disguised as piety. He was not preparing these children for life. He was conditioning them for something else entirely, something unnatural, something horrifying. The townsfolk of nearby Ambrose Crossing rarely saw the children, and when they did, during brief supervised trips for supplies, they were a disturbing sight. Pale, thin, and utterly silent, their eyes downcast, moving in a single, shuffling line behind the towering figure of Silas Blackwood. The isolation of the Blackwood Orphanage was absolute, a deliberate and crucial element of its design. Situated 5 miles down a barely there dirt track, it was buffered from the outside world by a thick expanse of primordial forest and the murky, whispering reeds of the Blackwater Swamp. This was not an accident. Silas Blackwood chose the location specifically for its seclusion, for its ability to swallow sounds and conceal secrets. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and travelers rarely had reason to use the decaying road that led to the property. This geographic quarantine allowed the Blackwoods to operate without scrutiny, to cultivate their own private kingdom of silence and sorrow. The folklore of the region only amplified the orphanage's sinister reputation. The woods surrounding the property were said to be haunted, a place where the spirits of forgotten settlers and vanquished Native American tribes still roamed. Locals spoke of the hollow men, spectral figures seen moving between the trees at twilight, and of a chilling, disembodied weeping that could be heard on moonless nights. These stories, whether true or not, served the Blackwoods' purpose perfectly. They created a supernatural barrier that was, in many ways, more effective than the iron fence. No one dared venture near Blackwood's Folly after dark. No one wanted to risk a confrontation with the phantoms of the forest, and as time went on, no one wanted to confront the growing unease they felt about what was happening inside the orphanage itself. The haven of innocence became an island, a place detached from the laws of man and God, where Sila's and Alara's disturbing ideology could fester and grow, completely unchecked by the prying eyes of the outside world. The Macabre theater was set, and its players, the unfortunate children, had no way of escape. Inside the walls of the haven of innocence, Alara Blackwood remained an enigma. While Sila's was the institution's iron-fisted ruler and twisted spiritual guide, Alara was its ghost. She drifted through the cold, silent halls like a wraith, her face always obscured by the heavy, black veil she never removed. The children knew her only as a rustle of dark fabric, a fleeting scent of lavender and dust, a pair of pale, slender hands that would occasionally place a bowl of thin gruel on the table before them. She never spoke. Not a single child ever reported hearing her voice. Her silence was a suffocating presence, more profound and unnerving than Silas's booming, whispered sermons. Her duties seemed to revolve around one specific, disturbing task, tending to the quiet room. This was a small, windowless chamber in the deepest part of the manor, its door always locked. The children were told it was a place for meditation, a sanctuary where the most devout could prepare for the great sleep. But it was a place of fear. When a child became ill or particularly melancholic, or worst of all, defiant, they would be led by Silas to the quiet room. Alara would be waiting, a silent sentinel at the door. The child would be taken inside, and the heavy oak door would be bolted shut. They were never seen again. When other children dared to whisper questions, Silas would explain that the chosen child had been blessed. They had achieved a state of ultimate purity and had been given to the earth, sent to their final, peaceful cradle before the world could stain their soul. The explanation was horrifying, yet it was delivered with such calm, paternal authority that the remaining children were too terrified to question it further. They simply learned that the quiet room was the end of the line. It was the place where the silent children of the haven of innocence vanished forever. The disappearances did not go entirely unnoticed. In the nearby town of Ambrose Crossing, whispers began to circulate like a foul miasma. The town was small, and people talked. They noted that while the Blackwoods continued to take in new orphans, the total number of children seen on their rare trips to town never seemed to increase. In fact, it seemed to shrink. A blacksmith remarked that he hadn't seen the boy with the distinctive red hair in over a year. A seamstress asked after a young girl with a prominent birthmark on her cheek, only to be met with Sela's Blackwood's cold, dead-eyed stare and a curt reply that the child had been adopted by a wealthy family from the north. This became the standard explanation. Whenever a specific child was inquired about, Sela's would produce a forged document, a letter of adoption from a family no one had ever heard of, in a city too far away to verify. The letters were always vague, the details unverifiable. Yet, for a time, this was enough. The townspeople were busy with their own lives, their own struggles. The orphanage was a county matter, and the magistrate, an elderly and complacent man named Judge Hemlock, was content to accept Blackwood's paperwork at face value. It was easier to believe in distant, wealthy benefactors than to confront the disturbing alternative. It was easier to accept the lie of adoption than to investigate the unsettling pallor of the remaining children or the ever-present fear in their eyes. But doubt, once planted, is a resilient weed. The stories of phantom adoptions began to curdle into something darker, a shared, unspoken suspicion that the children weren't being sent away to new homes. They were simply vanishing. The quiet, orderly disappearances became a part of the local lore, another layer of dread in the growing legend of the cursed orphanage on the edge of the swamp. The first real crack in the Blackwoods' fortress of secrecy came not from the town, but from within their own staff. They employed a single groundskeeper, a hard-drinking but observant man named Jebediah Cole. His duties were confined to the exterior of the property. He was never allowed inside the manor. He was tasked with chopping wood, maintaining the fence, and clearing brush. But from his vantage point he saw things that unsettled him deeply. He noticed the nightly rituals. Long after the children should have been asleep, he would see the faint glow of a single lantern moving from the back of the manor towards the fallow field at the edge of the woods. He would see the towering silhouette of Sela's Blackwood, often accompanied by the drifting, spectral form of Alara. Sometimes Sela's carried a long, narrow bundle in his arms. Jebediah, his curiosity piqued by fear and suspicion, began to watch more closely. He saw Sela's digging. Not large plots for farming, but small, methodical pits, each one roughly 4 feet long and 3 feet deep. The digging was always done at night under the cover of a new moon. The next morning the earth would be smoothed over, a new patch of disturbed soil in the ever-expanding field. Jebediah, a man not given to flights of fancy, tried to reason it away. Perhaps they were burying spoiled food or sick animals, but he had never seen any animals on the property, save for Blackwood's gaunt horse. And the bundles looked disturbingly, horrifically like the swaddled form of a small child. He held his tongue for months, terrified of Blackwood and in need of the meager wages. But the images haunted his sleep. The sight of the shovel, the rhythmic thud of earth in the dead of night, and the growing field of secrets. He started drinking more heavily, his nerves frayed until one day he could bear it no longer. He packed his few belongings and fled, but not before whispering his horrifying suspicions to a stable hand in town, planting the first seed of a truly macabre and disturbing truth. Jebediah Cole's whispered story found its way to the ears of Dr. Alastair Croft, the new physician in Ambrose Crossing. Croft was a man of science and reason, educated in Philadelphia and skeptical of the backwoods superstitions that permeated the region. He dismissed the groundskeeper's tale as the ramblings of a drunkard. Yet, the story lodged in his mind. He had seen the orphanage children himself on a few occasions and had been medically concerned by their condition. They were listless, underweight, with a strange, waxy pallor to their skin. He decided that, as a matter of public health, He should pay a visit to the haven of innocence. Citing a recent outbreak of influenza in a neighboring county, he presented himself at the orphanage's gate, offering to inspect the children as a precaution. Silas Blackwood was clearly displeased by the intrusion but could not refuse without raising suspicion. He reluctantly allowed Dr. Croft inside. The interior of the manor was as cold and austere as its owner. There was no art, no comfort, only bare walls and scrubbed wooden floors that smelled of bleach and something else, something faintly medicinal and cloyingly sweet, like wilted flowers. The children were assembled in the main hall, standing in their usual silent, rigid lines. As Dr. Croft examined them, his concern turned to alarm. They were not merely malnourished. They were lethargic, their reflexes slow, their pupils strangely dilated. When he questioned a young boy about a persistent cough, the boy simply stared blankly, his lips trembling until a sharp glance from Silas silenced him completely. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable, suffocating fear. Croft realized he was not in a school or a home. He was in a place of absolute psychological control. As he was leaving, he noticed a small, locked door at the end of a dark hallway. He asked what the room was for. "Prayer," Silas replied, his voice a low growl. "It is the quiet room." The name sent a chill down the doctor's spine. He left the orphanage that day with a profound sense of dread, convinced that something deeply sinister was at play. The children were not just sick, they were being systematically broken, or worse. Dr. Croft was a man of medicine, not law, but he could not shake the horrifying feeling that the children at the haven of innocence were in mortal danger. The listlessness, the dilated pupils, the waxy skin, it was not consistent with simple malnutrition. It suggested something more, something administered. It looked to his trained eye like the early stages of chronic poisoning. He suspected they were being sedated, perhaps with a tincture of opium or nightshade, to keep them docile and compliant. The thought was monstrous. He took his concerns to Magistrate Hemlock, the only man with the authority to investigate. The aging magistrate listened patiently to the doctor's report but was dismissive. He pointed to the orphanage's impeccable paperwork. The adoptions were all legally filed. There had been no formal complaints. He accused Dr. Croft of being an outsider, an educated city man who was letting local superstitions and the ramblings of a known drunk like Jebediah Cole cloud his judgment. "They are orphans, doctor," Hemlock had said with a weary sigh. "They are naturally melancholic. Mr. Blackwood has taken a great burden off this county's hands. I will not have him harassed by baseless accusations." Frustrated and horrified, Dr. Croft found himself at a dead end. The law, it seemed, was blind to the terror unfolding just a few miles away. His professional reputation was now on the line. To push the matter further without concrete proof would be to risk his practice and his standing in the community. He was forced to retreat, but he began his own quiet, discreet inquiries. He started researching old botanical texts, looking for local herbs and fungi that could produce the symptoms he had observed. He was unknowingly drawing closer to a truth far more macabre and bizarre than mere sedation. The sweet, cloying smell he had noticed in the manor, the one he had dismissed as wilted flowers, it was the key. He just didn't know it yet. His investigation was the first serious threat the Blackwoods had ever faced, and the darkness that operated with impunity at the haven of innocence was about to be challenged. While Dr. Croft searched for answers in his medical books, the history of Silas and Alara Blackwood remained a deliberate and guarded secret. They had arrived in Ambrose County as if from thin air, with a sizable fortune and no past to speak of. But every shadow has a source. Had anyone dug deep enough into the records of coastal Massachusetts, they would have found a devastating story. The Blackwoods were not their real name. Years earlier, under a different identity, they had been a devout, happy couple with a single child, a 7-year-old daughter named Serafina. She was by all accounts the center of their world, but their world shattered when Serafina was struck down by a virulent fever that swept through their town. Her death was swift and agonizing. The experience broke them. Silas, already a man of intense religious fervor, descended into a private, heretical madness. He became convinced that the world, with its pain, its sickness, and its sin, was an unfit place for a pure soul. He believed his daughter's death was not a tragedy, but a brutal corruption of her innocence. Alara, consumed by a grief so profound it stole her voice, followed her husband into the abyss. Together, they forged a new, terrifying theology. They came to believe that true salvation, true piety, lay in preserving innocence by shielding it from the contamination of life itself. The only way to save a child's soul was to deliver it to God before the world could leave its stain. Their daughter's death became the twisted genesis of their new mission. They liquidated their assets, changed their name, and moved south to Virginia, seeking a place where they could put their horrifying philosophy into practice. They were not building an orphanage to care for children. They were building a processing facility for souls, a place where they could save the innocent by sending them to the great sleep. Their charity was a mask for a holy crusade of the most disturbing and macabre kind. The core of the Blackwood's twisted ideology was the book Silas read from each night. He called it the Canticle of the Quiet Saint. It was not a recognized religious text. It was his own deranged scripture, handwritten in a spidery, Obbs's Sive script. The central figure of this text was not Jesus Christ or any known saint, but a fictional martyr named Saint Elspeth of the Soil. According to Silas's mythology, Elspeth was a young girl of impossible purity who, fearing the sins of the world, prayed to God to be spared the ugliness of life. God answered her prayer by putting her into a deep, death-like slumber and commanding her to be buried in the earth, where she would sleep peacefully, her soul untarnished, until the final resurrection. She became the quiet saint, a symbol of innocence preserved through a premature, sacred burial. This horrifying parable was the foundational myth of the haven of innocence. Silas taught the children that to be chosen for the quiet room was the greatest honor. It meant their souls were so pure that they, like Saint Elspeth, had earned the right to bypass the sorrows of life and enter the earth's cradle to await paradise. He framed it as a beautiful, peaceful transition, a holy slumber. This constant indoctrination, combined with the enforced silence, malnourishment, and possible sedation, created a state of profound psychological manipulation. The children became pliant, terrified, and confused. For some, the promise of an escape from their miserable, silent existence, even an escape into the grave, may have begun to sound like a mercy. Silas Blackwood was not just killing children. He was methodically dismantling their will to live, convincing them that death was a divine reward. It was a form of brainwashing so complete and so horrifying that it allowed him to carry out his monstrous acts with the chilling belief that he was not a murderer, but a savior. The mystery of the adoptions was a lie that was becoming harder to maintain. The turning point came with the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy named Thomas. Unlike many of the younger, more broken children, Thomas still had a spark of defiance in him. He also had a living relative, a widowed aunt in a neighboring town who had been trying for months to regain custody of him after falling on hard times. Her petitions to the county had been slow, but she was persistent. One week, she received a letter from Magistrate Hemlock informing her that her request was finally being processed. The next week, when she sent word to the orphanage, she received a terse, formal letter from Silas Blackwood. It stated with deep regret that Thomas had been adopted just days earlier by a wealthy merchant bound for Philadelphia and was already gone. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. The aunt, a formidable woman named Margaret, did not believe it for a second. She knew her nephew. He would not have gone willingly without saying goodbye. He would have fought. She traveled to Ambrose Crossing, a storm of grief and rage, and confronted Magistrate Hemlock directly. She accused Blackwood of lying, of selling her nephew, or worse. She demanded to see the adoption papers. Hemlock, flustered by her intensity, produced the document Blackwood had filed. It was signed with a smudged, illegible signature, and the Philadelphia address for the merchant was nothing more than a street name with no number. It was a blatant, lazy forgery. For the first time, Magistrate Hemlock felt a genuine tremor of doubt. The grieving aunt's fury was impossible to ignore. He was forced to concede that the paperwork was irregular. Pressured by Margaret's threats to petition the state governor, Hemlock finally, reluctantly, agreed to ride out to the orphanage and question Silas Blackwood himself. The carefully constructed wall of silence and deceit around the haven of innocence was about to receive its first official blow. The confrontation between Magistrate Hemlock and Silas Blackwood was a battle of wills. Hemlock, accustomed to deference, arrived at the orphanage with an air of authority, demanding to speak with Blackwood about the boy Thomas. Silas met him at the gate, his gaunt frame radiating an unnerving calm. He did not invite the magistrate inside. He listened to Hemlock's questions with cold, dismissive patience. When presented with the accusation of forgery, Silas did not flinch. He simply stated that the merchant was in a great hurry and that the paperwork had been completed in haste. He claimed the smudged signature was the result of a leaking inkwell. His excuses were plausible if weak, but it was his demeanor that was so disarming. He showed no fear, no anger, no guilt. He spoke with the unshakable conviction of a man who believed he was utterly beyond reproach. He then turned the tables on Hemlock, subtly accusing the magistrate of harassing a charitable institution and interfering with God's work. He spoke of the heavy burden he and his wife bore, caring for the county's forgotten children, and hinted that if such intrusions continued, they might be forced to close their doors, sending the orphans back to the streets where they came from. It was a veiled threat, and Hemlock understood it perfectly. Closing the orphanage would create a political and social crisis that the elderly magistrate did not want to handle. Faced with Blackwood's unnerving certainty and the unpleasant alternative, Hemlock's resolve wavered. He had no warrant, no hard evidence, only the word of a distraught woman and a suspicious doctor against a man who was, on paper, a community benefactor. Defeated, Hemlock retreated, muttering that the paperwork would need to be refiled with more care in the future. As he rode away, he felt a profound sense of failure and the chilling certainty that he had just looked a monster in the eye and backed down. Silas Blackwood had won the battle, but the war for the truth was just beginning. Dr. Croft, hearing of Magistrate Hemlock's failed attempt to confront Blackwood, realized the official channels were useless. He decided a different approach was needed. If he couldn't prove what was happening to the children inside the orphanage, perhaps he could find evidence of what was happening to them after they vanished. He remembered Jebediah Cole's story, the nightly digging, the small, shallow pits. The idea was macabre, almost unthinkable, but it was the only lead he had. He needed to get onto the property, specifically to the fallow field at the edge of the woods that the groundskeeper had described. To do so would be trespassing, a criminal act that could destroy his career. It was a risk he was now willing to take. He waited for a moonless, stormy night, the kind of night where the wind and rain would mask any sound he made. Under the cover of darkness, he made his way through the woods, circling around to the back of the orphanage property. He found the field easily. It was a desolate, empty patch of land, dotted with weeds and stones. Even in the gloom, he could see that the ground was uneven, marked by dozens of slight depressions and mounds, just as Jebediah had described. His heart pounded in his chest. With a small trowel he had brought with him, he began to dig at the edge of one of the most recent-looking patches of disturbed earth. The wet soil gave way easily. A few inches down, his trowel hit something soft. He reached into the shallow hole, his fingers brushing against what felt like coarse linen cloth. He pulled it back and his stomach lurched. It was a burial shroud, a small one. Tearing it open with trembling hands, he uncovered the pale, cold flesh of a child's arm. There was no doubt. Jebediah was telling the truth. The children weren't being adopted. They were being buried right here in this unholy, forbidden field. The horrifying discovery confirmed his worst fears, opening a new, even darker chapter in this macabre, cold case. The sight of the shallow grave sent Dr. Croft fleeing from the property in a state of shock and horror. But as he calmed himself, his scientific mind took over. He had not just found a body, he had found evidence. He now had the proof he needed to force Magistrate Hemlock's hand, but there was a complication. The body he had partially uncovered. He hadn't examined it closely in the dark, but he had seen enough. There was no sign of violence, no obvious cause of death. And there was something else, a detail that was deeply disturbing in its strangeness. The child's skin, though cold, had a peculiar flexibility. There was not the expected rigidity of a corpse that had been dead for several days. It was a small, medically inconsistent detail, but it lodged in his mind. He knew he had to go back. This time, not just to confirm a burial, but to perform a secret, illegal autopsy. He needed to know how these children were dying. Was it poison, as he had initially suspected? Starvation? Disease? The answer was the key to everything. This is a crucial turning point in our story, a descent into a darkness from which there is no return. The secrets of the Blackwood Orphanage are buried in that field, and the truth is more horrifying than anyone can yet imagine. If you find these forbidden histories compelling and want to support our investigation into the darkest corners of the past, consider subscribing to the channel. Because what Dr. Croft discovers next will not only defy medical science, it will redefine the very meaning of the word macabre. Your support allows us to unearth these forgotten stories and ensure they are never truly buried. A week later, under the cloak of another stormy night, Dr. Croft returned to the field of unmarked graves, this time with his medical bag. He was no longer just a concerned citizen. He was a clandestine forensic investigator, risking everything for the truth. He located the grave he had previously disturbed, and working quickly and methodically, exhumed the small, shrouded body. It was the boy Thomas, the very child whose disappearance had sparked his aunt's outrage. Laying the body on a canvas sheet, Croft began his grim examination by the light of a heavily shielded lantern. What he found was profoundly baffling. There were no marks on the body, no signs of struggle or injury. An internal examination of the boy's stomach contents revealed traces of only a thin, watery broth and something else, the remnants of a complex herbal compound he couldn't immediately identify. There was no evidence of common poisons like arsenic or nightshade. The cause of death was a complete mystery, but then he discovered the most disturbing detail of all. As he examined the boy's lungs, he found something that should have been impossible. There were trace amounts of soil and sediment deep within the lung tissue, and on the boy's fingertips under his nails, he found microscopic splinters of wood, as if he had been desperately scratching at a wooden surface from the inside. The implication was so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that Croft initially refused to accept it. The boy had not died before being buried. The soil in his lungs, the splinters under his nails, it was horrifying proof that he had been alive when he was put in the ground. He had inhaled dirt as he suffocated. He had clawed at the inside of his own coffin. They weren't just being murdered. Every single child in this field had been buried alive. The term buried alive, taphophobia, speaks to one of humanity's most primal fears. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this fear was not entirely unfounded. Medical science was still in its infancy. Conditions like catalepsy, comas, or certain forms of seizure could mimic the signs of death, leading to tragic, premature burials. This led to the invention of safety coffins, elaborate contraptions with bells, breathing tubes, and escape hatches designed to prevent such a horrifying fate. But what was happening at the Blackwood Orphanage was not a mistake. It was not a tragic misdiagnosis. It was deliberate. Dr. Croft's discovery shifted the entire nature of the case from one of murder and neglect to something infinitely more sadistic and psychologically terrifying. To kill a child is a monstrous act. To intentionally place a living, breathing child in a coffin, to nail it shut, to lower it into the earth, and to listen to their muffled screams as you shovel dirt onto them. That is an act of evil so profound it defies comprehension. Croft was now confronted with a horrifying new question. Why? What possible motive, what twisted ideology could lead someone to commit such a repeated, ritualistic, and uniquely cruel form of murder? The herbal compound he found in Thomas's stomach became the central clue. It was not a lethal poison. It must have been something else. A powerful sedative, a paralytic agent designed to induce a death-like state. He realized he was dealing with a level of premeditation and scientific knowledge that was far more sophisticated than he had imagined. The Blackwoods were not just cruel fanatics. They were meticulous architects of a waking nightmare, and he had to find out what strange herb held the key to their macabre ceremony. Armed with the horrifying proof of live burial, Dr. Croft went to Magistrate Hemlock a second time. He didn't just bring suspicions, he brought evidence. He laid out a detailed report of his findings: the herbal compound, the soil in the lungs, the splinters under the fingernails. He described the field of unmarked graves in chilling detail. This time, there was no room for dismissal or plausible deniability. The magistrate, his face pale with shock, was finally forced to accept the monstrous reality of what was happening at the Haven of Innocence. The vague unease of the town had crystallized into a concrete, verifiable horror story. A secret warrant was drawn up for the arrest of Silas and Alara Blackwood, and for a full search of the orphanage property. A posse of 12 men was quietly assembled, comprised of the town blacksmith, farmers, and other sturdy citizens deputized for the occasion. They were to ride out at dawn the next day. The plan was to surround the manor, breach the gate, and take the Blackwoods by surprise, securing the remaining children before any more harm could be done. There was a grim, determined silence among the men as they gathered their rifles and prepared for the raid. They were not just enforcing the law. They were on a rescue mission into the heart of a place that had haunted their collective imagination for years. They were about to step through the looking glass, to cross the threshold of Blackwood's folly and confront the source of the evil that had been festering in their midst. But they were all asking themselves the same question: how many children were still left to save? And what horrors would they find waiting for them inside that silent, forbidding manor? At first light, the posse, led by Magistrate Hemlock and Dr. Croft, descended on the Haven of Innocence. They found the high iron gate unlocked and slightly ajar, creaking eerily in the morning breeze. There was no sign of a watchman, no sound from within the grounds. The P.L. Ace was unnaturally silent. As they approached the manor, a sense of deep foreboding fell over the men. The front door was also unlocked. Pushing it open, they entered the main hall. The building was empty, abandoned. There were no children huddled in silent rows. There were no gaunt, menacing figures there to greet them. The entire orphanage had been deserted. It was as if the inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air. The rooms were stark and cold, but eerily tidy. In the dormitory, small, straw-filled mattresses were arranged in neat rows, each with a single, threadbare blanket folded precisely at its foot. The kitchen was scrubbed clean, with bowls and spoons stacked neatly on a shelf. But there was no food in the pantry, and the hearth was cold, the ashes swept away. It was a ghost ship, a place filled with the oppressive presence of absence. It was clear the Blackwoods had been warned, or had somehow sensed their time was up, and had fled. The rescue mission had failed before it had even begun. The children were gone, all of them. The men searched the grounds, their initial cautious silence turning into frantic, angry shouts. They found nothing. The posse had arrived too late. The Blackwoods had escaped, and they had taken the surviving children and their horrifying secrets with them. The empty manor stood as a silent testament to their failure, its quiet halls now holding the ghosts of every child who had passed through its doors. With the Blackwoods gone, the orphanage became a crime scene. Magistrate Hemlock, now fully invested in the investigation, ordered a meticulous search of the manor, looking for any clue that might explain the full scope of the horror and the whereabouts of the fugitives. It was in Silas Blackwood's private study, a small, sparsely furnished room, that they found the first key to his madness. Tucked away beneath a loose floorboard was his personal journal. It was not a log of daily events, but a manifesto, a terrifying window into a mind warped by grief and religious fanaticism. Page after page was filled with his spidery, obsessive handwriting, detailing his twisted theology of the Great Sleep and the purity of the soil. He wrote of his daughter, Seraphina, not as a victim of disease, but as the first blessed one, whose early death had opened his eyes to the truth. He believed he had been chosen by God to be a shepherd, not for the living but for the dead. His mission, as he saw it, was to guide innocent souls through the sacred gate of burial before the world could tarnish them. He did not see himself as a murderer. In his mind, he was a holy agent, a facilitator of salvation. The journal was filled with chillingly detached entries. Another soul was consecrated today. A boy, Samuel. He showed fear, a sign the world's stain had begun to take hold. The potion of slumber calmed his spirit for the journey. The earth accepted him with a quiet grace. The potion of slumber. The phrase leaped off the page at Dr. Croft. This was the name Silas gave to the herbal compound. The journal confirmed every one of the doctor's horrifying deductions. It was a premeditated, ritualistic process. The children were being systematically, consciously, buried alive as part of a demented religious ceremony. The search continued, moving from the study to the rest of the manor. The posse's anger and horror grew with every new discovery. They were no longer just looking for clues, they were excavating layers of pure evil. Finally, they came to the locked door at the end of the dark hallway, the quiet room. The door was made of thick, reinforced oak with a heavy iron bolt on the outside. The blacksmith, using a crowbar, broke it open. The room inside was not a cell or a place of punishment as they had imagined. It was something far more disturbing. It was a ceremonial chamber, an unholy sanctuary. The air was thick with the same cloying, sweet scent Dr. Croft had noted before, now almost overpowering. In the center of the room was a small stone slab like an altar. On a nearby table, a collection of medical and alchemical tools was laid out with surgical precision: mortars and pestles, glass vials and Bunsen burners. Jars filled with dried herbs and roots lined the shelves. This was the Blackwoods laboratory where they prepared the potion of slumber. Dr. Croft, his hands shaking, began to examine the herbs. He recognized some of them: valerian root, a powerful sedative; belladonna, which could cause paralysis and hallucinations. And then he found the key ingredient, a rare local fungus known in folklore as dead man's breath. It was known to induce a state of profound catalepsy, a deep trance where the heartbeat and breathing become almost undetectable. It created a perfect, horrifying illusion of death. They had found the Blackwoods' murder weapon, but there was one final, macabre discovery to be made in the quiet room. Against the far wall, leaning upright like a sentinel, was a single, child-sized pine coffin. It was empty, its interior lined with white satin. It was not a burial coffin. It was a tool, a vessel used to transport the slumbering children from this horrifying room to their final, shallow graves in the field. The discovery of the quiet room and the coffin solidified the horrifying reality. The posse moved from the manor to the field, no longer a place of suspicion but a confirmed cemetery. They began the grim, soul-destroying work of exhuming the bodies. With every spadeful of earth, the scale of the atrocity grew. One grave, then 5, then 10, then 20. They stopped counting after 30. The small, shrouded forms were lined up on the grass, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the years of unnoticed horror. Dr. Croft and Magistrate Hemlock oversaw the process, documenting each body. They were all children, ranging in age from as young as 4 or 5 to early teens. Most were emaciated, their bodies showing signs of long-term malnutrition. As the townsmen worked, their grim silence was occasionally broken by a choked sob or a muttered curse. These were men who had known some of these children. They had seen them in town, had perhaps given them a piece of candy or a kind word, never suspecting the nightmare they were enduring. The blacksmith recognized the boy with the red hair he had asked after years ago. Another man thought he recognized the tattered remains of a dress his own wife had donated to the orphanage. The personal connection made the horror immediate and visceral. This wasn't just a crime. It was a profound violation of their community, a stain that would never wash away. By sunset, the field was a landscape of open graves, and the full, staggering number of victims was becoming clear. At least 52 children had been given to the earth by Silas and Alara Blackwood. 52 lives, stolen one by one, in the silence of the Virginia woods. The journal of Silas Blackwood was the key to understanding the how and the why. But it was the final entries that provided the most chilling twist to the tale. The last few pages were written in a hurried, frantic script, a stark contrast to the calm, methodical entries that preceded them. It was clear they were written after Magistrate Hemlock's confrontational visit. Silas wrote that the unbelievers were closing in, that the profane world was about to desecrate his holy work. He knew their time at the haven of innocence was over. He wrote of a plan to flee, to find a new, more secluded place where he could continue his sacred mission. The last few children remaining at the orphanage, a group of 7, were to be taken with them. But it was the final, single-page entry that contained the story's most macabre and disturbing revelation. It was not about the children. It was about Alara. In a passage filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and pious exaltation, Silas described how his wife, Alara, had come to him the night before their departure. She had told him, through a series of gestures and written notes, that she could not go on. The grief for their own daughter, Seraphina, and the weight of their holy burden had become too much for her to bear. She believed it was her time to join the quiet saints. She requested that Silas grant her the same blessing they had given to the children. She wanted to enter the great sleep. According to the journal, Silas obliged. He prepared one final, potent dose of the potion of slumber, administered it to his wife, and as she fell into the deep cataleptic trance, he carried her out to the field. He buried his own wife alive, placing her in a grave among the children she had helped to murder. The final sentence of the journal was simple and haunting. She is at peace now, cradled by the earth she so revered. I am alone with the last of the flock. The revelation about Alara Blackwood's fate was staggering. She was not a fugitive. Her body was here, somewhere in this cursed field. Based on the journal's description, the posse began searching for a larger grave, one that would fit an adult. They found it near an old, gnarled oak tree at the edge of the field, slightly apart from the children's graves, as if to signify her status as the matron of this dead flock. The exhumation was a tense, somber affair. They uncovered a simple, unadorned coffin. Inside, they found the remains of Alara Blackwood. She was still wearing her severe black dress and the mourning veil, which had partially disintegrated, revealing a face locked in a peaceful, almost beatific expression. Her hands were folded on her chest, a single, withered wildflower clutched between them. The scene was grotesquely serene, a carefully staged tableau of martyrdom. It confirmed Silas's final journal entry and added a new, horrifying layer of psychological complexity to the case. Alara was not just a silent accomplice. She was a true believer, so devoted to her and her husband's insane philos. Afi that she willingly submitted to its ultimate ritual. She was both a monster and a victim of the same delusion she helped perpetuate. This discovery also solved half of the fugitive problem. Alara was accounted for, but it made the question of Silas's whereabouts even more urgent. He had fled, taking with him the last 7 children from the orphanage. The man responsible for at least 53 ritualistic murders was now a ghost in the wind, a boogeyman who had vanished from the face of the earth, with a new group of victims in his clutches. A manhunt was immediately organized, the largest Ambrose County had ever seen. The search for Silas Blackwood and the 7 missing children became a desperate, frantic affair that consumed the entire region for months. Posses scoured the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Virginia backcountry. Bounties were posted in towns from Richmond to the Tennessee border. Descriptions of Silas, tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes, and the children were circulated far and wide. But it was as if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. There were dozens of false sightings and dead-end leads. A farmer in a neighboring county claimed to have seen a man fitting Silas's description buying supplies, but the trail went cold. A ferry operator on the James River reported a silent man and a group of pale children crossing at midnight, but a search of the opposite bank revealed nothing. Silas was like a phantom, always one step ahead, a ghost who knew how to navigate the shadows. As weeks turned into months, a horrifying realization began to dawn on the search parties. They were looking for a man who knew how to live off the land, a man who sought out isolation, and they were looking for a man who likely had no intention of keeping those 7 children alive for long. Every abandoned cabin, Every remote cave they discovered was a potential grave site. The search was no longer just a manhunt. It was a race against time to prevent another macabre field of buried innocence. But the vastness of the American frontier was on Silas's side. It was a place where people could, and often did, simply disappear without a trace. The official search was eventually called off, the resources exhausted, the hope dwindled to nothing. Silas Blackwood and the last 7 children of the Haven of Innocence vanished from history, their fate becoming one of the most chilling and unresolved mysteries of the era. In the aftermath of the horrifying discoveries, the town of Ambrose Crossing was left to grapple with the legacy of the Blackwood Orphanage. The 52 exhumed bodies of the children and the body of Alara Blackwood were given a proper, Christian burial in the town cemetery. The entire community turned out for the mass funeral, a somber event that hung a permanent cloud of grief over the town. The Haven of Innocence itself became a place of local legend and terror. The manor was ransacked and eventually burned to the ground by angry locals, an attempt to purge the land of its evil history. But the fire could not erase the memory. The property, now known exclusively as Blackwood's Folly, was declared cursed, a forbidden place. Parents warned their children away from it, and no one dared to build on or cultivate the land. The field of empty graves, slowly being reclaimed by nature, remained a silent, gruesome memorial. The story became a cautionary tale, a piece of dark folklore whispered by grandmothers to frighten children into obedience. The name Blackwood became a local byword for unspeakable evil. But as the years passed, the official record began to fade. A courthouse fire in the early 1800s destroyed many of Ambrose County's records, including the warrant, Dr. Croft's report, and the official case file on the orphanage. History, it seemed, was trying to forget. The horrifying, documented truth of a serial-killing religious cult began to soften at the edges, transforming into a ghost story, a local legend that became easier to dismiss as fanciful exaggeration. And this is how true evil often survives, not by being remembered, but by being half forgotten, its sharp edges worn down into myth until no one is sure what was real and what was merely a story. The fate of the 7 vanished children is the final, agonizing question mark in this horrifying cold case. Did Silas Blackwood continue his macabre ritual in some new, undiscovered location? It seems almost certain. A man so driven by such a powerful, specific delusion is unlikely to simply stop. It is more than probable that somewhere in the remote Appalachian hills or the dense forests of the Ohio Valley, there is another field, another collection of small, unmarked graves, holding the last victims of the Haven of Innocence. This theory is supported by a handful of scattered, unverified accounts from the following decades. In the 1830s, a preacher in Kentucky wrote of a remote, isolated community governed by a tall, silent prophet who preached of the sanctity of the soil. The community reportedly practiced strange burial rites, but the preacher was driven out before he could learn more. In the 1840s, a fur trapper in what is now West Virginia stumbled upon an abandoned settlement. In a clearing, he found 7 small wooden crosses, crudely made, with no names or dates. He assumed it was a family plot, victims of some frontier tragedy, and thought no more of it. Were these sightings connected to Silas Blackwood? It is impossible to know for sure. They are mere whispers, echoes in the historical record, but they paint a chilling picture of a monster who simply moved on, continuing his holy war against childhood innocence, leaving a trail of tiny, forgotten graves across the expanding American frontier. The 7 children were never found, their names lost to time, their final resting place a secret kept by the unforgiving wilderness. They are the final, silent victims in this deeply disturbing and macabre case. Let us return for a moment to Alastair Finch, the surveyor who rediscovered the graves in 1823. His discovery did not, as one might expect, reopen the case. Instead, it was met with a strange and deliberate silence from the authorities in Ambrose County. The local officials, descendants of the generation that had allowed the horror to happen, had no interest in dredging up the town's darkest secret. Finch was quietly informed that he had stumbled upon an old, forgotten pioneer cemetery, a place of sickness and tragedy, and that it was best left undisturbed. He was told to redraw his survey maps, marking the entire Blackwood property as uninhabitable swampland. He was, in no uncertain terms, encouraged to forget what he had seen. The official cover-up, which had begun with the courthouse fire, was now complete. The story of the Blackwood Orphanage was to be permanently buried, both literally and figuratively. This official suppression is, in many ways, as disturbing as the crimes themselves. It reveals a community so deeply shamed and perhaps complicit in its negligence that its only recourse was to erase the history entirely. They chose to silence the victims a second time, burying their memory under a conspiracy of silence. This is why cases like this become the stuff of forbidden history. They are not just stories of a lone madman. They are stories of systemic failure, of a community that looked the other way, of authorities who chose convenience over courage. The true horror of Blackwood's folly is not just what Silas and Alara did, but that for a time they were allowed to do it. The silence of the good can be as deafening and as deadly as the actions of the wicked. The psychological profile of Silas and Alara Blackwood presents a chilling case study in shared psychotic disorder, or folie à deux. It is a rare psychiatric syndrome in which a delusional belief is transmitted from one individual to another. In this case, Silas was almost certainly the primary agent. His grief over the death of his daughter, Serafina, fractured his mind, causing him to develop a complex, paranoid, and grandiose delusional system to cope with the trauma. He could not accept that her death was a random act of nature. He had to reframe it as a sacred, meaningful event. He became the prophet of a new religion, with himself as its holy executioner. Alara, shattered by her own grief and rendered voiceless by trauma, was the perfect vessel for his delusion. Her silence and isolation made her completely dependent on Silas for her reality. His madness became her madness. She was not merely a passive accomplice. She became an active, willing participant, so deeply enmeshed in the shared psychosis that she saw her own live burial as a righteous and desirable end. This was not simple evil in the way we often think of it. It was a perfect storm of profound trauma, religious fervor, and psychological breakdown. They did not kill for pleasure or for gain. They killed because they genuinely, fervently believed they were performing an act of supreme mercy. And that in many ways is the most terrifying thing of all. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions, and in the case of the Blackwoods, their intentions, born of love and grief, led them to create a hell on earth for dozens of innocent children. The story of the Blackwood Orphanage serves as a dark mirror to the era in which it occurred. The late 18th century in America was a time of immense social upheaval and fervent religious revivalism known as the Second Great Awakening. It was an era of prophets and preachers, of new sects and utopian communities springing up in the wilderness. While many of these movements were benign, the atmosphere was ripe for charismatic figures with radical, and sometimes dangerous, ideas. Silas Blackwood's Canticle of the Quiet Saint can be seen as a micro-religion, a cult of two that adopted the language and fervor of the broader revivalist movement twisted it into something monstrous. His ideology, with its focus on purity, the corruption of the world, and the promise of a special salvation, was a dark reflection of common religious themes of the day. He was a product of his time, albeit an extreme and horrifying one. The case also highlights the brutal reality of life for orphans in post-revolutionary America. With no social safety net, these children were at the mercy of whatever institution or individual would take them. Their vulnerability, their voicelessness, made them the perfect victims. They were children no one would miss, a fact that Silas Blackwood exploited with chilling efficiency. The haven of innocence existed in a perfect blind spot, a society distracted by grand notions of liberty and religious destiny, which failed to notice the small, quiet horrors being perpetrated against its most helpless members. It's a haunting reminder that the darkest histories often unfold not in the spotlight, but in the forgotten shadows of a nation's grand narrative. What can we learn from a story so steeped in macabre horror? The Blackwood case is a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority and isolation. When any institution, be it a family, a school, or an entire community, is cut off from outside scrutiny, it can become a breeding ground for abuse and delusion. The high fence, the remote location, the fear instilled in the local populace, all of these were tools used by the Blackwoods to create a closed system where their horrifying reality was the only reality. The story also serves as a powerful testament to the handful of individuals who refused to accept the comfortable lie. The groundskeeper Jebediah Cole, who risked his livelihood to whisper the truth. Thomas's aunt Margaret, whose fierce love for her nephew refused to be silenced by bureaucracy. And especially Dr. Croft, a man of science and reason who risked his life and career to uncover a truth so monstrous it defied belief. They are the heroes of this grim tale, their actions a small flicker of light in an overwhelming darkness. Their courage reminds us of the profound moral responsibility we have to question what we are told, to protect the vulnerable, and to listen to that small, nagging voice that tells us when something is deeply, horribly wrong. The greatest tragedies in history are rarely inevitable. They are often the result of a series of small failures, of moments when people chose to look away. The story of Blackwood's Folly is a permanent, haunting cry from the grave, demanding that we never look away again. The lingering power of this case lies in its unanswered questions, the dark voids in the historical record that our minds rush to fill. The most significant, of course, is the ultimate fate of Silas Blackwood. Did he die in the wilderness, a lonely madman consumed by the elements? Or did he succeed in founding another, more secret haven, continuing his ritualistic killings for years, undetected? The idea of him surviving, a gaunt, aging figure still preaching his gospel of the grave to a new generation of stolen children, is a uniquely chilling thought. And what of the physical evidence? Silas Blackwood's journal, after being used by the magistrate, vanished. Dr. Croft's detailed medical report was lost in the courthouse fire. All that remains today is the land itself. Local legend in Ambrose County holds that the field where the children were buried is still haunted. People claim that on still nights, you can hear the faint, muffled sound of weeping coming from beneath the earth. They say the wildflowers that grow there are unnaturally pale, and that no bird will sing in the trees that overlook the site. It is a place where the sorrow has soaked into the soil itself, a permanent stain on the landscape. The story has passed from history into the realm of the supernatural, a campfire tale told to scare and to warn. But unlike most ghost stories, this one is rooted in a horrifying, documented truth, making it all the more powerful and all the more disturbing. The ghosts of Blackwood's Folly are not just specters. They are the memories of real children, whose final, terrifying moments have been forever imprinted on that forbidden piece of land. The central, most horrifying element of this entire case remains the method, live burial. It is a method of murder that maximizes terror, a slow, agonizing descent into madness and suffocation in a dark, enclosed space. Why would Silas and Alara choose such a uniquely cruel ritual? From Silas's journal, we can infer that in their warped minds, it was an act of profound symbolism. The children had to be planted like seeds of innocence alive, so that their souls could be preserved in a state of suspended purity, ready for the final resurrection. To them, killing the child first would have been a desecration, an admission that the body and therefore the soul had already expired and begun its decay in the profane world. The paralytic state induced by the potion of slumber was the key. It created the perfect loophole in their delusion. The child was medically alive, yet appeared dead, allowing them to perform the burial while maintaining the belief that they were not murderers but holy gardeners tending to a crop of souls. It was a perfect, self-contained, psychotic logic. The horror for the victims is almost impossible to contemplate. Imagine a child, already terrified and confused, being given a sweet herbal drink. A profound lethargy overcomes them. Their limbs grow heavy, their vision blurs. They are aware but unable to move or speak. They feel themselves being wrapped in a shroud, placed in a wooden box. They hear the lid being hammered shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. They feel the jolting motion of being carried, the sickening finality of being lowered into the ground. And then the sound of dirt thudding against the lid, growing heavier and heavier, stealing the air, sealing their fate. It is a slow, conscious journey into their own grave. It is a horror that words can barely touch. In the end, the story of the Blackwood Orphanage is a mosaic of systemic failure, private madness, and forgotten victims. It is a cold case that can never truly be closed, as its chief perpetrator vanished, and the full count of his victims may never be known. The tale exists in a gray area between documented history and macabre folklore, a space that makes it all the more unsettling. Official records were destroyed, memories faded, and a horrifying truth was deliberately suppressed, allowed to fester in the local imagination as a ghost story. It serves as a stark warning. The most profound evils are often committed in plain sight, hidden behind a veneer of piety and respectability. Silas and Alara Blackwood were not cackling monsters from a fairy tale. They were quiet, seemingly charitable people, driven by a recognizable human emotion, grief. Their story shows how the path from profound sorrow to profound evil can be a short and terrifying one, especially when insulated by isolation and fueled by fanaticism. We are left with the silence of Alara Blackwood, the enforced silence of the children, the silence of the town, which for too long chose not to ask the hard questions, the silence of the historical record, where so many crucial facts have been erased. And finally, the silence of the grave, where 52 children lay, their stories almost lost forever. If these kinds of forbidden histories, the stories that have been deliberately buried, are important to you, please support our work. Liking this video and subscribing to the channel ensures these voices, however faint, are not silenced forever. Every story we unearth is a victory against the quiet, creeping erasure of the past. The legacy of Blackwood's folly is not one of ghosts or curses, but of a chilling and unresolved ambiguity. The definitive truth died with its perpetrators. Silas Blackwood carried his final secrets with him into the wilderness, leaving a permanent scar on the American psyche. His story is a testament to the darkness that can lurk within the human heart, a darkness that can be rationalized, codified, and turned into a holy mission. The abandoned field in Ambrose County is more than just a burial ground. It is a monument to a forgotten Holocaust, a place where the machinery of a private, insane religion ground its innocent victims into dust. It forces us to confront the terrifying idea that we may never truly know the people around us, that behind a neighbor's placid smile or a benefactor's generous donation, a completely different and horrifying reality can exist. How many other Blackwood follies are out there, hidden in the remote corners of history, their stories lost to fire, neglect, or deliberate suppression? How many other silent fields hold the bones of victims whose names we will never know? The case of the Blackwood Orphanage remains a whisper in the annals of crime, a horrifying footnote that reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not those who lurk in the shadows, but those who walk among us, convinced they are saints. And the final, lingering question, the one that truly haunts the darkest corners of this macabre tale, is a simple one. When Silas Blackwood finally died, alone in the wilderness, did he truly believe he was bound for heaven? Or in his last moments, did he finally hear the muffled screams of 59 innocent souls, calling to him from the cold, dark earth?